Hey, welcome back to Relentless Positivity. I'm your host, Joe Martin. Hey, we got an exciting one today. So, you may have heard of pickleball, you may have seen it around, but do you know much about it? Well, we have an expert for you today. Dr. Lynn Cherry is going to come in here and tell us all about pickleball. Thank you so much for coming on, Lynn.
It is so great to be here. And I have to admit, Joe, I love your energy.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just had some coffee not too long, if you can't tell. So, so you describe yourself as a pickleball fanatic. So that's what I want to hear about that. So, how did you discover the sport of pickleball?
I moved to Connecticut from Texas almost 4 years ago. And I had lived in Texas and California. So I moved to Connecticut and I'm thinking, what the heck am I going to do during the winter inside? They don't have very good mountains for skiing there, I would say, growing up in California. So I just looked at the local recreation center and I saw that they had something called pickleball. And honestly, I had never, ever heard of the game, but it was a sport. And I looked it up on YouTube. It's played with a paddle, there's a ball involved. I had played racquetball. So I thought, oh, yeah, I might really like that. So I went ahead and just showed up at the gym to see what it was all about. And as soon as I kind of stuck my head in the gym, somebody said, "Hey, do you want to play?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't have a paddle." And they're like, "Oh, that's okay." And then they pull one out of their bag and they drag me onto the court. I play literally for 5, 10 minutes and I was hooked. I immediately went to Dick's Sporting Goods and bought a paddle so I could continue to play.
Awesome. Yeah, it's nothing like when someone invites you in to do something because these people aren't always like that in some sports. So that's great that's what I've heard about the vibe of pickleball. It's a very friendly and inviting vibe. That's what I like. What I've heard about it. So let's go back to the beginning. So why is it called pickleball?
There's two stories that circulate within the pickleball world in terms of how the sport got its funny name. And the preferred version is that, in terms of the history of the game, there was a couple families that got together over one holiday weekend. And this is like back in the mid 60s. So it's really a long time ago. And apparently they got together and ended up inventing the game because they were going to play badminton, but they couldn't find the shuttlecock that they needed to use for the game. So they ended up inventing pickleball. But apparently, one of the family's dogs loved to chase the ball, which is actually a very similar to a wiffle ball. It's a plastic ball. The dog would chase the ball, pick it up, and run away with it. And of course, the dog's name was Pickles.
There you go. So what's the other story? So that's one of them. What's the other story?
Well, the other story is really not as fun. But one of the ladies who was involved in the creation of the sport, apparently she had been a rower. And in rowing, you've got kind of all the best rowers in that first boat. And then the rowers who were not quite as good ended up just kind of a mishmash of people. And that's called the Pickle Boat. So that's kind of the other origin story for the sport of pickleball.
And you mentioned the word pickles earlier. So I've heard a rumor. What is your nickname, by the way?
This is so ironic. My childhood nickname was Pickles because my favorite book as a child was Pickles the cat. Actually, it was Pickles the fire cat, and my uncle was a fireman. So that was always my nickname growing up. I could never imagine that, 50 years later, I'd be playing a sport called pickleball.
It's just meant to be, right? It's just predestined to be a pickleball champion, right? So,
Yeah.
so let's talk about it a little bit. So it's the fastest growing sport in the United States. Why is that? We mentioned a little bit about the friendly environment. What else makes it such a popular sport?
One of the other things that really makes it a popular sport is it's very, very easy on your body. And it's also very easy to learn. So if we take the first aspect, if you're somebody who is older, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, it's not hard on your body. That's because the paddle's light and the ball is very light and the court is smaller. It's about half the size of a tennis court. So just, being able to physically be able to do that regardless of your age, or if you've had knee problems or back problems, which, many younger people do too, that certainly is one of the main reasons I think it's so attractive.
Yeah, that's it. Like I said, I live here in Huntsville, Alabama, and they've just started building beautiful facilities around here. We got indoor, we got outdoor. So it's been really growing around here as well. So that's cool. How is the game played? So people maybe they've heard of it, but how does it play? You mentioned it's a little bit like tennis, a little bit like racquetball, kind of a mishmash of that as well. So explain us how it works.
It is. The court is about half the size of a tennis court. It's actually a similar size to a racquetball court. Generally, I would say most people in pickleball play doubles. And I think the big reason for that is it is a very social game. So just having that group of four people just kind of creates that more social environment. So you can play singles, certainly. I would say probably 95% of the people who play do play doubles. But so you've got four people on the court, and you can only score points when you serve. And probably the biggest thing that people will hear about with pickleball in terms of the rules is that you have to stay out of the kitchen. And there's really a caveat to that. The idea is you have to stay out of the kitchen when you hit the ball in the air, otherwise known as hitting a volley. And actually, that's a great rule for the game. And the reason that kind of came into being was it was an equalizer. So, given that the family dynamic was, when the game originated by the people who invented it, wanted kids and adults to be able to play. So they didn't want somebody who was tall to be able to have a big advantage at the net. So the kitchen is kind of one of those things where it kind of equalizes the game. Now, normally games are played to 11 points. You just score 1 point at a time, and you can only score points when you serve. So a little bit different from how you can score points even when you're not serving in tennis and they've got rally scoring in volleyball. So it is a little bit different. It's a little bit actually more like racquetball in terms of the scoring, with the games typically played to 11. Once in a while, you'll see games also played to 15.
Okay. Yeah. So what is the kitchen? Did I miss that? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So the kitchen is really the area about 7 feet from the net on both sides of the court. And so that's the area where you can step into the kitchen, past that line that's there, if it's 7 feet, or sorry, if the ball bounces. However, if you decide to move up close to the net, so you're within the kitchen, within 7 feet of the net, and you take the ball out of the air and volley it, that you cannot do.
Okay, so you can't just sit there and smash it at the at the net like a tall person on a kid. That makes sense. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
So let's talk about what is your sports background?
I have really a varied background. From the time I was very young, I was involved in sports. Growing up in Southern California, played a lot of volleyball, indoor and outdoor. I did play actually a year of basketball and volleyball in college. After that, I got into playing racquetball, which I did for quite a few years. Played at a fairly high amateur level, and just recently here, I picked up pickleball. And what happened when it was probably about 7, 8 years ago, I tore my ACL. So I tore a major ligament in my knee. And a lot of people will go through for that injury and get surgery. And it's a year-long recovery. It's a major surgery, major recovery. And so I chose not to go that surgical route, and I just kind of rehabbed on my own. But I didn't play any sports for probably about 5 years. And that's because I didn't feel that my knee could handle it. And when I saw pickleball, I'm like, well, the court's smaller. I don't have to move as much. And it doesn't look like it's going to be as hard on my knee. So amazingly, I really am able to play the game without issue. So that's another really appealing factor. And don't get me wrong, because pickleball, I say I don't have to move a lot, but the reality is that when you play more advanced players, the game is very competitive. It's very fast moving. There's now professionals in the sport who are they're young, they're athletic. The game can be as competitive as you want it to be. And believe me, you will get a great workout. I can't tell you how many people that I've talked to on the Pickleball Fire podcast who, by playing pickleball, have lost 50, 60, 70, 100 pounds.
Yeah, it's very addicting. The people I know that they get into it, they love it, and it's super addicting. And any way you can get up and move your body, I'm all for. So I'm trying to encourage more people to go try it out. So let's say I want to get started tomorrow. What do I do? You said you went to Dick's Sporting Goods. What would I do? Do I need equipment? Is there going to be equipment there most of the time? How does it work?
I would say that if you go to a beginning level clinic, a lot of times they will have equipment. You can play this at a park. You can play it at the YMCA. A lot of YMCA's now have pickleball. In places like that, will usually have paddles. But if you do go to a park, you probably will need your own paddle. And to get started, you can go to, something like Dick's Sporting Good. You can go to Amazon, and for $50, you can buy a couple paddles and some balls. And then you don't need a net because normally any place you play, they will have nets available. But that was one of the things that was sold out very quickly during the pandemic was pickleball nets when we were all really locked down and people would buy them. You could buy a 10-foot or a regulation size net, put it in your driveway. If you lived on a street with a cul-de-sac, you could put it there, and you and your family could easily have a game of pickleball. So nets run $50 to $100 on average.
Okay, yeah, cheap start off, $100, I can get going, right? So I'm right in
Mm-hmm.
there. So yeah, so you talked about it earlier, but how is this bringing generations together? So it's not very many sports or activities really do that. So how is that bringing, the older and the younger folks together?
That's a great question, and I think that's what really does make the game so great is that you can have fun at any age. And one thing that happens in pickleball is, even if you're a brand new beginner on the court, the players who know how to play the game will bring you onto the court, have you play with them, even if they're advanced players. But I think the game is so easy for anybody. That's why you kind of have that intergenerational aspect to the game. But what's even more interesting is that if you've got a very good amateur player, maybe a tournament level player, high amateur, and they're in their 70s, they can actually play with those 18 and 20-year olds, and the game is still very competitive. And the big reason for that is so much, in a sport like tennis or racquetball, it's all about power. Pickleball, you can hit the ball hard, but it's actually a game of finesse.
Okay, yeah.
So again, that equalizes things. So, you don't have to be young, strong, and powerful. Really, if you've got some great experience as a 70-year-old and you're playing the 20-year-olds, and even though you're in exactly the same division, they all compete together.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I know people have that competitive spirit. Sometimes their body is holding them back. So, what about someone who's got like yourself, who had some past injuries or is worried about getting hurt? What's some ways they can avoid injury with pickleball?
Well, certainly stretching and warming up, two key critical ingredients. I always, highly recommend doing both those things. Takes a little bit more time, but it's well worth it to avoid the injuries. And then I think the other thing is, to pretty much know your body. I know that even though I like to play very competitively and at a very high level, it definitely does put that strain on my knee. So I may choose not to play, quite at that level. In fact, I don't play tournaments because of that. I just don't believe I know enough about my knee and my body that I can go out and play pickleball for 2 hours. But when you go to a tournament, you might play for 7, 8 hours in a day.
Oof,
Yeah,
that's a lot of pickleball right there. So,
it is. It is.
so maybe there's some people listening right now who are already playing, but they're trying to get a little bit better. How do people improve? What's some tips they can improve with?
I think the key thing is really to make sure if you're coming from another sports background like tennis or racquetball, to remember that there's a slow element to pickleball and a fast element. So the fast element is more akin to a power game, but there's also that slow element where accuracy and strategic shots are what you need. And the typical comparison between something like tennis and pickleball is that tennis is really like playing checkers, whereas pickleball is more like playing chess because it's just so much more strategic. So, if you've got good technique, I think the next key or the next tip is really to start to understand strategy, how to construct a point, and move on from there. And honestly, there's some great teachers and instructors out there right now. The professional pickleball players, a lot of them teach on the side and they run clinics and camps. I highly advise checking some of those out. And that's another great way to improve your game.
And some great ways to find some of these people is not only your website, but also your podcast. Tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Oh, right. The podcast. I started just over a year ago with the Pickleball Fire podcast. I put out 2 episodes a week, and one of them is a professional or an instructor will come and talk about, the game and how to improve your game. And then on Thursdays, I usually do a show talking about something from the industry or, just something, maybe there's a lot of people who recently have been writing books about pickleball, some fiction, some nonfiction. So I'll have them on just to, kind of get a wide range of topics for the podcast. But yeah, come on out to the Pickleball Fire podcast. You can definitely learn more about the game, especially on Mondays.
Absolutely. And that's pickleballfire.com/podcast. And I'm going to link all that in show notes. And they can also check out your magazine. So, man, you went all in. By the way, did I read correctly that after 1 month you started the website?
Oh yeah, that's true. I had never done that before, but I knew as soon as I played the game, I thought this is the most amazing sport in the world, and the people are great. So yeah, I started the website. I started the podcast during the pandemic, during the worst of the lockdown, and then I realized with the podcast I had so much content that I decided to put out a magazine because I also had a journalism background. So it's everything is just, growing so incredibly from there. Actually, the International Federation of Pickleball, which is the organization that will bring the game to the Olympics, reached out to me. So now Pickleball Fire magazine is their official publication for
Man,
their organization.
you're like the go-to person for pickleball. I mean, when you were a kid and your nickname Pickles, it was just meant to be even back then, right?
I think so.
Well, hey, you sold me. I'm going to go play now. I've been kind of thinking about it and going back and forth, but I'm going to go play. I'm going to update you after my first game too. So, if anyone's listening right now, if you could convince them with, maybe one sentence, what would you say to someone who's thinking about playing pickleball right now?
You will you will not regret it.
That's it. I'm excited to go play. So thank you so much. I love being around people who are fired up about what they do, and that's definitely you right there. Thank you for out there spreading, getting more people moving, more people active. It's just helping people find that lifetime sport that some people don't have. So thank you so much for all you're doing out there.
Well, thank you, Joe. It was great to be on your podcast.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll link all this in show notes. Go check that out. Go check out your local pickleball courts, and let's all get started in 2022. Let's get this thing going. So, hey, great to meet you, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks so much.